I hail from New Hampshire, born and raised there actually, and for the majority of my professional career, I've had an eye on how do we include all students in their neighborhood schools in a way that is meaningful for students, all students within that school, positive for families and constructive, and also positive and constructive for faculty, staff, and administrators. So how do we engage in continuous improvement and the evolutions that have happened in education? How do we keep up with all of that and keep asking the next best question? I joined the SWIFT Center, the School-Wide Integrated Framework for Transformation Center. Thus, you know why we call it SWIFT Center, and not School-Wide Integrated Framework for Transformation Center. I joined the SWIFT Center when it came into being about 4.5 years ago. We won an award from the U.S. Department of Education. And my University of New Hampshire, our team there is part of a sub-award with Kansas University. The University of Kansas is the lead on the SWIFT Center. And our work is to engage, we work currently with 5 different states, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maryland, Mississippi, and Oregon. And we work with 64 schools across those states, 16 school districts, and the 5 state agencies to take a look at what would happen if we had a school-wide framework for all children and we had all arenas of the educational system engaged. Could we get some things in place across administrative leadership, educator support, inclusive academic and behavioral instruction, shifting staffing arrangements, service delivery models, engaging families and community members, and supporting districts to take a lead on the implementation effort alongside their school leaders, and then for the district to be responsive to school level needs, taking a look at policy structures, support structures that might need to shift to kind of make room for the new ways of work within the schools. And then where districts were struggling to move some policies that may be outside of their sandbox, to engage their state agency partners in broader change conversations for their states. We're really excited to be wrapping up that 5-year project that actually ends this October. But what we've done with that one project is we've leveraged it to start what we now call the SWIFT Education Center. And that broader center now is an umbrella for several projects going on, that 5-state project that I just described only being one of them. We've since brought on the entire state of California, and we have a rather large contract with California to implement multi-tiered system of support, MTSS, statewide in all schools. So just a handful. We'll get this done in a couple months, and then we'll come back and tell you about that experience. Thank you. One person got it. Excellent. It's a large state. So we are engaged in that work now, which has a little bit of a different implementation strategy than we used in the first state. So we keep trying out different ways to figure out what's going to be most effective for people, what's most efficient to get things in place in schools and districts. We're continuing to expand the work. We're engaged with this great Indiana team and sparking some good work here in Indiana, and also now working in the state of Washington with a school district, rather large school district just outside of Seattle. So we're really excited to share the examples that we're getting, the lessons that we're learning, in hopes that it makes your lives a little bit easier. Take some good stuff that we've tried out, and if it's working for you, adapt it locally and run with it. And if it didn't work for us, we'll recommend you might not want to try it that way, so that you don't feel like you're just kind of trying to reinvent a wheel there. So my job, basically, since I'm paid off of your tax dollars, is to try to give you everything that we're learning as we're doing it. So I will be referencing our SWIFT Center website often, because we have a multitude of resources there that we've culled, crafted, and honed over the last 4.5 years, and I want you to be able to take full advantage of those. And I'll probably reference other national centers' work as well, because there's lots of good stuff out there that you all can tap. Before we get too far into things, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. Jolly already let you know where the restrooms are, just down the hall to the left there. And in your packets, we've also put together lots of stuff for you. So let me make sure that you've got your full packet here. You should have an agenda for the day. You should have an activity packet for some specific note-taking and specific conversations that we want to have throughout the day. And you should have a PowerPoint. I've printed them at 2 slides per page just so that small print is big enough for you able to see it and highlight it and circle it and cross it out and say, what was he thinking across the day as we go through this. Now, I woke up this morning in a mood and I did redesign a couple of things. It's going to be okay. I can write you a little visual schedule if you'd like to help kind of get through those changes. But we'll talk through them as we get into them. Most of them are kind of picture examples that bring to life some of the text that's already on the page. And I did reorder a couple of slides. It's going to be okay. And I'm going to point those out to you. And it's going to be, I think, very manageable. I think I've only put in maybe 10 or 20 extra text slides. No, I think there's maybe 3 extra text slides. So I'll pause longer for those of you who like to get every word down when we get to those slides. Although I did see some people were already got their phones out and ready to just snap a picture of the screen, and that's good with me as well. And in terms of taking pictures today and maybe sharing with the world your excitement of what we're doing here today, we did set up a hashtag on Twitter. So feel free to tweet away if that's one of the ways that you kind of capture and save for yourself particular lines throughout the day or big messages throughout the day. Just use hashtag Swift IEPRC 2017. Feel free to log in there and do that. If you want to direct any of them at me, if you want to give me a little private commentary as we're going through the day, I'm at MC McSheehan. So it's MC, MCS, HEEHAN. Feel free to send nice messages in public and private message me for anything else. Our learning objectives for today are rather bold, so we'll see how we do. We want you to be able to leave here either remembering or being able to describe some rather dramatic shifts that have occurred in special education, general education over the last 3 decades, where we've gone from talking about least restrictive environment, LRE, for kids with disabilities, and now we're talking about school-wide MTSS for all kids. How is that still special ed? What's going on with that shift? And I'm going to try to bring that to life for you, and that's where the new slides come in. How many of you were at Focus on Inclusion back in February? Okay, excellent. So those slides will be redundant for you because I took them right from my keynote that I did. It's just fun to talk Star Wars. So I dropped in my Star Wars slides because it just helps give a marker for the transitions in the field. Who knew? You'll see it, you'll love it, it's fun. Then we'll move into components of multi-tiered system of support. So as we build that up and a look at inclusive practices, we'll shift over to talking about multi-tiered systems of support. We'll look at components in action in schools. So we've got some nice videos for you to kind of see what things are looking like. We'll unpack those videos together. You'll all be in a series of structured dialogues about the components of MTSS and what those are and how those come together. We'll do some activities with those, including bingo. You know it. So we'll be playing a little bingo later this afternoon. And hopefully through that set you up with enough of an understanding of some key components of MTSS for you to be able to kind of start at least a self-assessment of your system. So we're going to focus you in on 14 core components as we describe them within the Swift Center and take a look at those components relative to your current system. So if you're wanting to leave here with an action plan of like, what do I go do next? There'll be 14 things to focus on. A little short list for you. Okay, and we'll give you till Tuesday to get those in place. So you'll be leaving here with some action steps. So that also kind of represents the agenda that we have for today. I've just kind of laid out those learning objectives in terms of the agenda, so you'll see the same things there. But let's get started by just learning a little bit more about you. Is there anybody still logging online, getting online and logging on to Kahoot? If so, just raise your hand and the staff members will assist you if you need some assistance there. And while they're taking care of the last couple of people, let me just kind of find out who's here. How many of you are individuals with disabilities and or family members of somebody with a disability? 1, 2, 3. Okay, there's a handful of us in the room. Great. And how many of you are special education teachers? Okay, so you're going to have majority vote today. Use that carefully. General education teachers. Wonderful. Look at you all sitting together, having each other's back. That's so sweet. We'll take good care of you. You're safe here. Related service providers, speech pathology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, school counselor, psych. Okay, no making fun of them today. They're all here. Okay. Building a school level principal, administrator, assistant principal. Okay, welcome. Glad you're here. District level administrators in any arena of administration or district-wide work. Okay, several of you. Excellent. Who am I missing? External organizations and agencies who provide services to or technical support to schools and districts? Okay. Co-op level people here? Okay, handful of you. Okay, pretty much every stakeholder's in the room, no mocking anybody. Takes all the fun out of the whole thing. All right, let's see where we go. All right, so that's who's here. What I'd like to understand is a little bit of your experiences with PBIS, RTI, and MTSS. And if you don't know the letters, that's okay. As we go into Kahoot, I'm going to ask you 3 questions about each of those. Your knowledge base of it, whether or not you've actually been practicing it in some way, and whether or not you've been practicing it in a school-wide model, right? Just to kind of help me guide where I want to load the information. Now, how many of you have ever done a Kahoot before? Okay, several of you have, so you know the best part is making up a really good nickname, right? You can use your real name, that's fine. It's just not as fun. So, give me a Hoosier welcome with the best nicknames here. And let's explore your experiences with PBIS, RTI, and MTSS using this Kahoot. 9 questions in this Kahoot. 4 choices for each question. With you on that. So it looks like we're rounding out around 60 folks that were able to get in, which means probably not everybody is logged in. But let's go ahead and get it started. I'm knowledgeable about components of PBIS. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. I'm knowledgeable. Five seconds. Get him in there. All righty, what do we got? Okay, most of you agree that you're knowledgeable. Handful of people want to get up here and take the pointer from me. And 10 of you are on the disagree end of life. Okay. All right, so we've got some spread on PBIS. Now let's look at whether or not you've practiced it. Again, I've practiced it in a school. Agree, strongly agree, agree. Disagree, strongly disagree. And what do we got? Okay. Not as much on the practice side, but we've maintained about 42 of you in the agree section, and now we're up to 21. So we're getting a little bit more of a split here on the actual practice of it. Okay. And now, have you practiced it in a school-wide model? My school or our schools have an agreed-upon school-wide PBIS framework. We are all talking the same lingo. Let's see where we land. A bit of a distribution here. Okay. Okay, close to a split on that one. All right. Now let's do that same trio for RTI, response to instruction, response to intervention. I am knowledgeable. Few people. All right, here we go. Okay, most of you are feeling like you've got some good knowledge there about RTI. Have you been practicing it? Have you practiced RTI? Okay, majority of you are practicing RTI. Good to know. And are you practicing it in the context of a school-wide framework? So my school or our schools have an agreed upon RTI framework. Okay, most of you do. Good to know. And now let's go to MTSS. Knowledgeable. Okay, not feeling as knowledgeable on the MTSS front, but still quite a few of you do. Have you practiced MTSS? Okay, not so much in the practice bit, but one of you strongly agrees. So somebody in here has got a school-wide model at least. Okay. Sorry, somebody's got a practice in it. Do you have a school-wide model for it? Okay, all answers in. Okay, so that's the tip. All right. Okay, thank you very much for playing. So that will set us up for probably some rapid movement in some sections of it. How many of you would say you include all students within general education settings 80% or more of their day, including in general ed instruction? Okay, we've got a handful of you there. And how many of you are including, to some extent, students with significant disability labels into general education settings for at least a portion of their day? Okay, so many of you are doing that work. All right, that's helpful to know your kind of backgrounds there. As we get into this work, you're going to hear me talk about repeatedly 3 different key elements for implementing anything. So as you think about your inclusive practices, as you think about PBIS, RTI, or MTSS, I'm going to use this implementation equation repeatedly. PBIS, RTI, MTSS are a set of effective practices, right? Bundled together in a really specific way. They're a what that we want to try to implement. An effective practice is something that's well described, it's teachable, it's observable, I can measure it. Right? It's bounded enough that I could replicate it somewhere else. Right? So that's my what that I'm trying to implement. An effective implementation strategy is how we come together to get that thing in place. Right? So oftentimes, our efforts to implement are, let me send people to workshops. Let me train them up. And there's a lot more to an implementation strategy. Yes, we have to build the teacher competence, the administrator competence. We also need to then think about the difference between training and coaching. And there's a huge difference in terms of competence between training and coaching. In fact, with the best of trainings, we can get about a 10% to 15% implementation rate. But when we put in job-embedded coaching, peer learning, peer mentoring, formal instructional coaching, we bump up our implementation rate to 85 to 95%. So, yes, you can train. It's not going to give you the same outcomes that you're aiming for. We need to have an effective implementation strategy. That also needs to look at the organizational side of that competence. So it's one thing to have the competence, but then maybe have access to the data that you would need for that given practice. Right? To think about what's the leadership within the building for that practice. What are the roles and responsibilities in the building for that practice? So we start braiding over from the effective implementation approach to also adjusting the context. Not all schools or districts are positioned to just drop in a given practice. You've got to adjust some things, whether that be a little portion of the practice or a little portion of your own staffing and service delivery models. If you want to implement co-teaching, and I'm a special educator and I'm in your building, all of a sudden I'm wondering whether or not I'm still a special educator if I'm co-teaching with you. Am I just your assistant now? Do I still have the same identity? It's going to change school-wide schedules if we're doing a co-teaching model, how I'm arranging my staffing. That's going to be shifting. So we've got to create an enabling context that fosters the new way of work. All three of these are essential. And you'll see what kind of math equation is this? An X in math represents multiplication. Excellent. Good job. Just a little scaffold. It's a multiplication equation. And with multiplication equations, if you put a 0 into any one of the boxes, you get 0 for outcomes. Right? So I could pick the best of the best practices. Right? Response to instruction, response to intervention has a wonderful effect size. Sorry. You're not taping, are you? Effect size, wow, on student achievement. It's Friday, it could be fun, look out. Not well medicated today. So if we put a 0 in here, we're not going to get the expected outcome. So yeah, I pick RTI, I pick direct instruction, which includes modeling, informative feedback, which should have really high impact, but I have a crappy implementation strategy. Or my school isn't really welcoming to that practice. Or I'm the only 2 co-teachers in the building and everybody else kind of mocks us. Right? Not a welcoming environment. That's going to affect what outcomes you can expect from that practice. So we've got to pay attention to all three. The what that we're trying to implement, how we're doing it, and where we're doing it, if we're really going to make a difference in the outcomes for our kiddos, our families, and for one another. And that includes adjusting kind of who we're working with and how we're working with those who's. So as soon as you talk about a how of an implementation strategy or adjusting where you're doing the work, you're talking about humans being involved, which makes it a little messy sometimes. Right? We get into issues of buy-in and consensus building that are going to influence the whole shebang here. So as we go through the day and I'm talking to you about a particular practice, always have in the back of your mind, okay, that's piece number 1. I'm going to need to have strategies for the other 2 boxes. And in a one-day workshop, we can't give you all of it, but we're going to give you little pieces. Everything we can get in there, we're going to dump in today. All right. So the what's in our field have shifted dramatically over time. So I want to kind of take a little tour. For those of you who were with me in February at the Focus on Inclusion conference, you know the tour. You can sing along with it. We're going to talk about that shift from LRE and FAPE all the way through inclusive practices and now looking at school-wide models for MTSS. So when we started off Public Law 94-142 back in the 70s, those of us who were around at the time, it was civil rights legislation. We had more than 1 million kids not even going to their neighborhood schools. They were home. They weren't getting education anywhere. So we had a major issue on our hand. And so we've got legislation passed in 75, that said pretty clearly, to the maximum extent appropriate, we want all kids going to their neighborhood schools, being educated in general ed settings, unless they need some kind of support that doesn't make sense there. Right? So if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in that general ed classroom with aids and services isn't going to work, then we can look at other settings. But that's where we start. That was the initial law. Pretty straightforward, or so we thought. It took a few years before the actual regulations came out. Very loud, though. So here we were, all excited. We have this new hope for this new legislation that's coming out. The actual regs come out a couple of years afterwards. And I use Star Wars because the release dates on Star Wars actually line up with when our regs were coming out and how we were beginning to understand this new hope. So it's just a little memory cue for me to kind of organize my history of policy and practices in the field. If it works for you, run with it. So we've got Public Law 94-142 that came out, and at the time, as the other Star Wars movies were releasing, we figured we would up our ante in special education practices too, and we started to think about even kids with more significant disabilities. Maybe could actually be in the regular classroom or could participate and benefit from engagement with kids without disabilities. And gosh, if we look long term in their lives, doesn't it make sense for a person with significant, severe handicap, severely to profoundly handicapped was the language we were using at the time, doesn't it make sense for them to get to know the people in their local community? Because when they grow up and they're going to the neighborhood store or they're going to the bank, it's going to be their classmates who are going to be working in those settings. So won't we actually kind of increase the likelihood that they'll have a sense of belonging in their local neighborhoods and local communities? And won't that increase the likelihood that somebody who knows them might want to bring them into the workplace? Might want to hang out with them when they're adults as well. So we thought about this as a lifelong endeavor, not just the here and now. Our eye was very much on the social connection of it. We were at that time still very much so talking about functional life skills, independent living skills, as the focus for the population of kids with the most significant disabilities. And then we had some clarifications happen because as we thought about this presumption of the regular ed class as the place, and actually, yeah, this slide is in there, right? It's on page 5. 6, 5, go ahead, be specific. We have this presumption of the first placement option considered for every child being the regular classroom in the school, right? And before we would consider putting them elsewhere, we would explore the full range of supplementary aids and services. Now that was a nifty clarification, because it meant, this clarification meant for us that when we're looking at individual kiddos, regardless of what their history is, regardless of what we have for a continuum of supports and services in our system, we can't automatically just say, well, we have the autism program for you, because that's your label, so we're going to put you right over here. The law actually says, no, you first have to figure out, can that kiddo be supported in the regular ed setting? You have to raise that question and figure out what the constellation of supports might look like this year for the child before you weigh that other option. That was an important clarification for us. We're not all doing that yet, but that was an important clarification legally speaking. Then we had some other pushback happen. one of the places that pushed back was my very own hometown in Rochester, New Hampshire. So proud to be born and raised in Rochester, New Hampshire. 3 houses down from where my mother grew up, where she was born and raised, a mile away from where her mother was born and raised. My father grew up just across town. His only brother still lives across town. My mother's only brother lives immediately next door to where they grew up, 4 houses down from where I live. I was the radical. I moved 20 minutes away to Newington, New Hampshire. Yep, very bold individual that I am. We have this local community, and this is the kind of value set that I was raised in and didn't recognize because I was so steeped in it. Was so steeped in it that it wasn't until college that I met my first person with a significant disability. Never met anybody in Rochester. Little did I know, Rochester was working really hard to keep kids with severe disabilities out of our local schools. I didn't know that. But Timmy W. was a kiddo whose family said, no, let's put Timmy in the local school. Let's do that. Pretty sure the law gives us, the right to ask for that, and that he might actually benefit from that. And Rochester said, well, what you don't understand is Timmy's really severely disabled. He's like profoundly disabled. And he's so disabled, he's not going to benefit even from special ed that we would provide in the local school. He really should not be in the neighborhood school. And first round of courts agreed with Rochester, and then it was appealed, and the appellate court said, yeah, not so much. You got to try stuff out here. And so part of this argument that they made was around eligibility for services, and that there should be a point at which we can reject individuals because of the severity of their disability. And what the courts clarified and has been upheld ever since the late 80s is this notion of zero reject. It does not matter how severe your labels are. That's not our starting point for this conversation. This is a civil rights legislation. So we're going to start with, we said kids with disabilities, you have a disability, so it doesn't matter how many syllables come before that disability label. The capacity to benefit from special education is not a prerequisite for being eligible to get those services. Right? It's like saying, I'm going to know how you're going to write cursive before I start teaching you how to write cursive. Although that service didn't really benefit me much. Educational methodologies, and this was the big argument behind it, educational methodologies are not static. They're constantly evolving and improving. School districts' responsibility to avail itself of these new approaches. And that's really our punchline of this segment of the day. Things have been evolving pretty rapidly. So there's a lot for us to keep up with. And it feels like a reasonable expectation that we would continue to learn and grow as educators, since that's kind of what we promote for our kiddos. So let's hold ourselves to that. So this was the first guy I ever met when I was in college. But when I met him, he didn't look like this. I was in my first Children with Exceptionalities course. And as a good undergrad who had no experience with people with severe disabilities, I would come in and I would kind of listen to what was going on in the back of the class. And the faculty member for this course was really good at getting other people to teach the course. So we constantly had guest lecturers. About halfway through the course, I see this guy in the hallway. And when I see him, he's, not wearing the bow tie. He's got like a t-shirt on, and I see that he's drooling on himself, and he's got a scooter, and he's got a dog with him, and somebody's assisting him, and I'm hearing him make groaning sounds, and I'm thinking, oh, so she's going to talk about him today. And I got into class and got out my notepad and started to listen as my faculty member, Jan Nisbet, introduced today's guest lecturer. Huh? I just heard him making sounds in the hallway, but I didn't hear any words come out. How's this going to go? And he pulls out a big green board that has words and letters all over it, and he starts tapping away on the board. And Jan is standing over his shoulder, and she's saying aloud what he's typing out. I was completely blown away. I had this really different set of assumptions about who this man was. And he proceeded to give one of the most powerful lectures I've ever had in my entire years of courseworks. Cracking jokes, hitting deep points, most of the jokes going over my head, because I was just trying to make sense of what was happening in front of me. I just never had that experience. And then once I got my head around it, I was really upset. I was really mad at Rochester. Because how is it I'm in college and I'm just figuring this out? How come I've never met anybody like this before? And so in the same course, I heard about the Timmy W. case because it was happening at the time I was taking the course. And I'm like, oh, that is really wrong. I'm really not happy now. So this guy, Bob Williams, who was the lecturer that day, has gone on to be the commissioner for the Administration on Developmental Disabilities in the Clinton administration. He's gone on to be an assistant secretary for health, assistant secretary for Health and Human Services. He's had numbers of positions in a variety of administrations, still working in DC, high up within the chain. No schlump. Kind of got it going on. Now he uses higher-end electronic devices to communicate and is doing a lot around not only civil rights but also employment issues for people with significant disabilities, particularly those who might use some kind of augmentative communication, who don't speak with their voice in a way that's understood by other people. So stories like Bob force us to question then what and how we're teaching locally. Right? So we were thinking it was about the social experience of getting to learn about people in your neighborhood. You might not get any content benefit from within your experience in general education if you had a severe disability. And people like Bob and others started to push back, and we started trying new things in the field. And so around the time the second round of Star Wars movies comes out, we've been poking around for 10 years. And at the same time, policy shifting, and in fact, the reauthorization of the IDEA, which was happening in '97, the regs were getting released right on schedule with the next Star Wars round. And it included in it these notes about access to general curriculum. And the language talks about participation in general ed curriculum and instruction. Right? That's what access means, that I'm participating in the general experience of the school. That I have direct access and engagement with the general standards that all kids are expected to learn. Okay, well, that's one way to put it. Okay, we'll try teaching to that. And we were working with kiddos, individual kiddos, where this was starting to happen. So we were like, all right. And we also, in that same reauthorization, started to hear about school-wide PBIS and the power of having a school-wide model with agreed-upon ways to teach proactively pro-social behaviors and to prevent or interrupt the possible occurrence of more severe behavior problems if we got in there early. The final little thing they dropped into that legislation was a little bit ahead of our time, but we didn't really get our heads around it until No Child Left Behind came out with the next Star Wars movies. And it was this clause that said, if you're going to administer any district-wide, statewide, national assessments on kids without disabilities, you've also got to assess kids with disabilities on whatever it is you're testing over here. Which, when it first came out, we were like, okay, well, that makes sense. Of course that makes sense. But then with No Child Left Behind, clouds parted, angels sang, and accountability fell with a thud on our schools. We entered the era of accountability and high-stakes testing. And it says we have to assess kids with severe disabilities on their learning of reading, math, and writing, and science. All right, how do we do that? Thank you for passing that law. Then we all started scrambling. How the heck are we going to do that? And there were national efforts to construct alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards. And some of those early ones were, shall we say, flexible in their design at best. We're measuring program indicators, and do you have proximity to peers without disabilities? And the feds came back a few years later and like, no. We said you have to measure academic learning. So we all swallowed hard and we redesigned our assessments. The policy was a bit ahead of our practice and our research. Research at the time on whether or not kids with severe disabilities could learn the general curriculum, learn core essential components of reading and math and writing, was not, shall we say, abundant. At that time in 2003, 2004, there were about 100 studies worldwide that looked at teaching reading to kids with severe disabilities. And what's interesting is it was enough research to let us know that, in fact, it looked like the population could learn components of reading. We just weren't doing it systematically. Same thing with math. When we looked over to science, there were a total of 10 studies worldwide that have been conducted in the last 30 years. So we don't know crap about science. So if we were to look at evidence-based practice at the time, evidence-based practice would say, we don't know, you shouldn't teach them science. There was no evidence to say a kid with a severe disability couldn't learn chemistry. We'd all just been assuming it because we didn't have the teaching methodology for it. Again, I'm going back to Timmy W. This is about evolving teaching methodologies. We hadn't tried doing it in a systematic way and documenting it. We were just all assuming it couldn't happen. And I was right in there with them. So, 2005, next Star Wars movie comes out. We have another reauthorization that clarifies for us, maybe you should be looking at school-wide models for academics as well. It should help you out with your identification of kids with specific learning disabilities. Instead of doing this discrepancy analysis approach, let's take a look at whether or not they're responding to good instruction. So the requirement is you all have to be providing evidence-based, tier 1, good, first, best, not good, best first instruction in reading and math and science. And then if kids aren't responding, add on. Give them a little bit more. And then if they're not responding, do a little bit more. And be looking at their response to instruction and intervention as a way to determine specific learning disability. Real different approach for many of us at that time. But what the policy was doing was reflecting back the best practices that were happening in pockets of America, and then saying, well, since the pockets can do it, y'all got to do it. So again, we swallow hard and we get to work. We roll up our sleeves and we're like, okay, those schools can figure it out, we can figure it out too. And we started hunkering in to do it. PBIS had us not looking at whether or not we could create the perfect child, but it said, when you're looking at whether or not a child's engagement is problematic, look just beyond the individual child to the environment and the adults and the materials and the content. So we started putting our eyes to the tween spaces between individuals and their environments, their contexts. That was a huge shift. For so long we had thought that behavior was in the person and we had to fix the person. That aha, that it was somewhere between the interaction space with other people and other materials and other expectations and environments, was new for a lot of us. But that was a huge shift, and now to have to apply it school-wide meant we had to get a lot of people on board with that notion. It also forced us to look at the function of behavior, which we had been doing for a while in the severe disabilities arena, where like when kids hit their heads with their hands and they don't have a way to communicate, they may be trying to tell you something. When they pick up the mug and whip it at your forehead, they may actually be requesting a drink or letting you know you have really bad perfume on. Right? Like there could be a function to this behavior that's communicating something to us. And we had to now kind of look at application of that understanding in a school-wide model. Big pushes, big changes. Right? Jack was one of those kiddos that pushed us kind of on all fronts. When I first met him, he was in 4th grade. He was described as functioning at the 2-year-old level when I met him. The 2-year-old level as a 4th grader. And his team in 4th grade were adapting the content to his math and reading by asking the question, what would a 2-year-old do? Because somewhere in his file 3 years earlier, somebody had written one line, and he's got a really big file. One line in that file says Jack functions at a 2-year-old level. And somehow, in all of the data we had on Jack, that became the organizing force. And that actually was a model that we taught at one time, identify the functioning level, teach to that, grow that forward, right? So, okay, We identified his developmental level. What would a 2-year-old do during this math lesson? Like, they were trying to make it make sense. But what it looked like was a paraprofessional within 3 feet of him for 95% of his day, doing a lot of discrete trial training across the day on pretty basic skills. And him not responding to that instruction. But because we hadn't really made the connection between what you do for this population and these school-wide models that were emerging, nobody was paying attention to whether or not he was responding to the instruction. They were just noting he still hasn't mastered these specific skills, so we're not ready to move on yet. We're just going to keep teaching you that same stuff for the next 4 years till you get it. Through the same teaching methodology. Why? Because that teaching methodology is evidence-based. Well, there's a disconnect. If you're using an evidence-based practice and you're not getting a response from the child, you change your practice. Right? So we introduced some different ideas, and that was, let's get him access to the really good instruction that's happening up there from the general ed teacher. And we started setting him up to participate in that instruction, and he started to respond to it. Should have seen the first day when the general ed teacher, we started working with him in November. She started with him, obviously, in September. And for 3 months, she had never had a moment of like a true interaction with Jack as the general ed classroom teacher. It was all him and the para. And here we were in November, and she had her first moment with him, and she just bawled her eyes out. Because here she had been feeling so isolated as a general ed teacher. I've got this kiddo in my classroom. I feel no connection with him. I feel completely incompetent as a teacher. All I want to do is see some response from him within this classroom, that something here works for him and makes sense on the academics. She saw evidence of it socially, but she was not feeling all that informed as the classroom teacher when it came to Jack. And she had her first moment. And what she had figured out was, if I apply some of his interests to the design of my class-wide questions, he responds. It was a pretty amazing inroad for her, right? Give a good teacher good information, they're going to use it. So as soon as she had the information, she ran with it, and she figured out a lot during 4th grade. So by the time we got into 5th grade, which is where this photo is, we were asking much more refined questions, particularly around his communication and wanting to get that up and running. Because at the time that I met him, he had a very restricted communication system. He had a 9-item choice board, yes and no, and I need a break, and I got to go to the bathroom, and I'm mad. And I argue if those are the only things you could say, you'd be mad too, right? So Jack had behavioral stuff going on. He would get frustrated in class. He'd rip his shirt. He'd pull your hair. He would sob. You would sob. There'd be screams, right? It was really hard until we got his communication up and running, and suddenly a lot of the behavior stuff started to go away. Got him engaged in good general ed instruction. Some of the behavior stuff started to go away. Described as a kid who couldn't stay on task for more than 5 minutes, suddenly 45 minutes into a lesson, people were like, oh, Jack didn't need a break. Huh, that's interesting. It's like he's getting this. So we kept working on curricular adaptations and communication supports. We had the occupational therapist coming in to kind of figure out, is there a better positioning for the device for him to make his selections during class? Speech pathologist is looking at his interactions with other classmates. Can we figure out a better way for him to actually communicate academic content during these small group lessons? Right? They had figured out that we could go teach him discrete skills down the hall. We still got to work on generalization back to the classroom. Let's take a step out. We'll come to the classroom, and we'll teach the skills in context, which actually has a stronger research base. They were smart. So as we wrapped up 5th grade, we saw a kid who had full membership within that general ed classroom. He was not only physically in the room, he was with his classmates, not just socially, but also academically. We had figured out a way to get him engaged in grade level curriculum, learning grade level standards, because he was participating in the general education instruction. So he could show benefit from that instruction with an adapted book to the kind of 2nd grade level of reading, but maintaining the same content. He was showing that he could pick up a book, track it, read to himself, by April of that school year. Looks a lot like reading. Let's give him a quiz. Oh, Jack passed the quiz. Look at that. he can learn the general curriculum. Oh crap, we weren't doing that for 3 years. Guess there's going to be some gaps to fill in, right? So, got a kiddo now who's passing quizzes and tests. He's actually coaching some of his classmates on what the answers should be, in part because his classmates figured out that he, in the adapted version of the books that he basically had the cliff notes of the books, which was a brilliant adaptation strategy and really fostered peer interaction. That's one way to do it. Wasn't what we had in mind, but it had a great effect. We needed to be presuming that he was competent from the get-go and that the barriers were how we were supporting his behavior, that the barriers were how we were engaging him in general instruction, that the barriers were how we were setting up his communication device to say, yes, no, I need help, I'm mad, versus giving him the words that other classmates were using. Pronouns, action verbs, helping verbs, the actual words from the Maniac McGee story. Right? Given access to those words, we saw a student that looked much more competent. He didn't change. We changed what we were doing. Yeah, I mean, he changed in that he finally had access to stuff that he could use. Right? Wasn't that he knew everything that was going on in 5th grade, but he was showing us he was getting a lot more than what we originally were thinking. So let me start with the assumption that you got something going on there, and that once we figure out the right constellation of supports, you'll be able to show me that good stuff. Different starting point than what we'd had with our initial methodologies for teaching the population. One of the other evolutions was raising the question about, well, what's the impact on all the kiddos without disability? You said that Jack was in there screaming in classroom. How did that affect everybody else in the classroom? Well, given that Jack had been included, at least physically, in the room since the get-go, a lot of classmates were used to the screaming. They'd be like, oh, somebody's having a bad day. That sucks. And they'd go back to work. We were paying, as adults, much more attention to it than some of the classmates were. And in fact, if we look at larger scale studies that have looked at the impact of having a student with significant disabilities in the general classroom, we find out that students without disabilities are actually making greater progress too. Some of those adaptations that we put in place for Jack, like the adapted reading books, actually increased other kids' reading achievement too. Imagine that. Reading text at different levels for the same purposes repeatedly, and we're increasing literacy skills. It's novel. I love it. So let's take a look, because we're evolving now from this one kid at a time where now entire cultures of schools are shifting. Right? Not everybody's doing this in every school around the country, but some schools are, and one in particular is Concord High School. They've done some amazing work at looking at the full diversity and variability of the kids in the Concord, New Hampshire area and saying, what's the high school that would be an inclusive high school for all of these kiddos in our neighborhoods? What would that look like? What would that feel like? What would I see going on there? And particularly one principal, Mr. Conley, over the last 15 years, has had a huge impact on what that building looks like, sounds like, and feels like. Unfortunately, a few years ago, Mr. Conley got diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and proceeded to lose functioning. And his high school included him anyway. He maintained his principalship for another year into the disease, even when he lost his speech. So as you look at this video, I want you to think not just of including kids with disabilities, but let's blow it out now to an inclusive culture. So as you watch this video, and you take notes in your activity guide, because that's what the directions say, we want to think about this broader notion of an inclusive culture. What does it look like? Now, many of you, since you raised your hands earlier, may have inclusive cultures within your towns. Excellent. Sometimes it's helpful to just get out of our own experience and look at somebody else's to then come back and reflect. So that's what we're going to do here. Let's take a trip to New Hampshire with me. And I'd like you, at the bottom of the form, to actually list, for whom is this inclusive? right? Sure, you can say, well, I know he's got a bumper sticker that says all means all, so I'll just write all here. That's great. I want you to break that down a little bit. Right? Who's being included as you watch this? And I'm only going to make you watch the first 4.5 minutes of this video. If we did the whole video, none of us would recover. It's a pretty powerful story. But let's take a dip, shall we say.
Good morning and welcome to the Concord High School Class of 2012 graduation exercises.
Concord High Principal Gene Conley, known for his legendary energy.
What was your first reaction when you found out you had ALS?
I was in shock. It was like being in a bad dream, and I wanted to wake up. I remember leaving the doctor's office and my wife getting sick in the parking lot.
Mr. Conley, what's your biggest fear? How does it feel knowing it could all end at any time?
In what ways has your family helped with everything?
I have lost the use of my vocal cords, but because of modern technology, I have a machine that allows me to speak. However, all of you are missing my Boston accent. I look at every day as a gift, and I want to make every day count.
Thank you.
So the full video, I'm told, will be available shortly on, I think, the ALS Foundation website, if you're interested. It's not there yet. I kept checking. It just went to national release. So, what does an inclusive culture look like? Who's being included? Turn to your neighbor, take a minute to share that information, and then we'll do some large group share out. What does an inclusive culture look like? Raise your hand or call it out. This is where you participate. A little extra step there for you.
I think it just looks like general life.
Looks like general life.
It doesn't look like anything different. Everyone's talking to each other and everyone's doing everything.
Okay, everyone's talking with one another. Everyone's doing everything. Looks like general life. Okay, yes?
You're giving people what they need.
Giving people what they need. Great. I need $1 million.
She's not the teacher.
She's not the teacher?
We noticed there wasn't any sympathy for people with disabilities. That like when they announced that kid's name, it wasn't like, oh, it was like cheering like they would for everybody. Like there was no sympathy.
There was no sympathy, right? No awe moments, right? Like, good, you got it in. That's what we were going for. Next. Right. Excellent. Yes?
Like the little girl when they were asking questions and talking about him when he was younger, her question was, does he like sunflowers?
Right.
So not anything at all about a disability or
No.
anything.
Not even really about him. It was really all about her. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Here's what I like when I get on board with that. Yeah. Perfect. Right? No caretaking in that relationship. Right? If we're going to bond over something sincere, it should be something that I like. Great.
And also the unified team that, kids aren't competing. The gen ed kids aren't kids with disabilities helpers or mentors. It's actually a competition. So they are competing on the same team against siblings.
Great. And they're competing on those teams. Right? And it's equitable. Right? Those roles are equitable. It's not the classroom helper kind of situation. We're not going to give you credit for joining unified sports if you're a kid without a disability. Right? Some kids get actual credit for helping a person with a disability. That sends a message. Right? Like, In New Hampshire, the minority are people of color. Should I get credit for befriending somebody of color? It's kind of the same message. When we put it in those terms, it's like, ooh, well, that just sounds downright offensive. Yes, ma'am.
Celebrated, not just accepted.
Celebrated, not just accepted. You're really different. You are wearing purple, and I am loving that purple, right? Like,
There you go.
like, not just like, oh, you blend in well enough, right? No, baby, you want to wear purple, you wear it. Own it, right? Excellent, great. So differences can actually be celebrated. Anything else you notice there?
There weren't any divisions in socialization.
It didn't appear that there were any divisions in socializations. No, like, obvious pockets, right? From lunch, right? You didn't see like, well, here's the severe disabilities lunch table with all the paras, every other student, right? And here, like, there, you didn't see that. Right? Lots of natural supports going on, natural interactions. Now, does that mean everybody liked one another? No, not so much. I've been in that school. There's some people who really hate each other. Right? It's like it's everyday life. It's a high school, right? Like, the thing is, they don't hate you because of your label.
Right.
It's really because of who you are. Right? Right? It's that sincere dislike. Right? Not just because of what you're wearing or the title you bring to the table. I just don't like you. Right? Equal opportunity to be disliked. So there's a characteristic of an inclusive culture. Which is a huge shift, at least for me. I don't see that in all of our high schools in New Hampshire. Do you see that in all of your high schools here in Indiana? So there's clearly still, you know, if we think that that's attractive and desirable, which is still an if maybe for some of you, I think it's really attractive and really desirable. I would like that in Rochester, New Hampshire. I would like that in lots of towns. I actually have a cousin, two cousins with severe disabilities who are entering high school in Rochester, New Hampshire. And that high school does not look like Concord High School. And I want it to be for them. I really want it to be for them. Yeah. I think we still have work to do. Any big questions come up for you as you watch that video? Mr. Conley is still alive, by the way. He retired from the principalship. He just had to step down. It was too exhausting. And he's still alive. If you watch the rest of the video sometime, most of it is a compilation of interviews. All the kids in the high school wrote questions that they had for him, and then they were all taped in interviews with him, asking their questions. And some of the questions were like, how do you get that fabulous hair? Right? Like, okay. And then some were, you know, have you pondered suicide because of this diagnosis? I mean, there's a whole range of questions, and it's really raw and beautiful. So I encourage you to watch the rest. But back to Star Wars, because there was a whole new round of films that came out and are coming out, and they're going to set for us a marker here about MTSS, because in part, our Swift Center was really getting going with our technical assistance with our 64 schools around 2015, which really interrupted me being at the opening night for that movie. Really a problem for me. And as we began engaging those schools, what we were saying was, so the organizing force here is not individual kiddo supports, right? It's to lift your gaze ever so gently beyond the kiddo who's your target historically marginalized person, to look at the structures and the systems that exist just beyond them. What are those that are setting the kiddo up for being included or not, for including all kids or not, for academic achievement, behavioral success, social emotional well-being or not? What is that system behind the screen? So our work started there with that heart of the prevention model. And the slides that I'm showing you If you want to, you can actually see all of these in a short video called All Means All, and it's on our Swift Schools YouTube channel. Just go to All Means All Swift Schools YouTube, and you will see the full 30-second video or whatever it is. It's just I can't read the slides that fast, so I need to clip the little movie section so I can read them. So let's take a look. When we now talk about inclusive practices, we think about Samuel Habib, and we think about Jack, and we think about Mr. Conley being included. Now let's look at that in the context of multi-tiered system of support. And notice I'm not telling you yet what I think that is. Right now we're going to explore it together. Some of you would like to have the right answer first, so you know exactly what you're looking for. But I want to be clear that this is an evolving methodology. So I'm going to share with you at some point today what I think my current best guess is and what our center's best guess is at what this thing is, and know fully well that when I come back in 5 years, we're going to have a different definition. So let's construct it together. So as you look at this next video, and cuddle up with your jackets because it's so nice and warm, make a list of inclusive practices that you see. Like, what are specific things that are happening that seem to be promoting this direction of inclusion? And are there more systemic things that I see evidenced that would suggest a broader set of structures and practices behind the scene that are making that one inclusive practice even possible or viable or effective for these kiddos? So just draw a line right down the center of your next activity guide page. We are all the way up to page 3, knocking it out of the park, and it's not even 10 o'clock. And list your inclusive practices and anything you see that says, well, maybe that's what MTSS is. Now, one of you in here is going to have all the essential components listed because you said you were super knowledgeable, you're practicing it, and you're doing it in a school-wide model. So I want to see your sheet when you're done because I probably can learn something. So let's take a look at this short video produced by Swift from our direct schools that we've been working with.
Good morning. Morning, guys.
Good morning. Make sure you take your hoods off. Good morning. Make sure you take your hood off, baby.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you guys? All right.
When it all comes together. A Swift film by Dan Habib.
So let's kick off this beautiful day with our Irvington cheers. So give us an IRB!
We had done all this focus on racial equity here at Irvington, yet we still had students marginalized because of perceived differences. And so I see that as a real societal gap and actually a human rights issue in our society. The fact that Swift embraced that put me on board immediately, honestly. Swift has allowed us to use our resources very creatively and pool all of our resources together to best serve the needs of all of our students. And not just students with IEP, Swift is about all students at the school. And just think outside of the box in order to make sure all students' needs are met.
Learning from their peers.
Most likely what you guys are going to be working with today is the 6 feet long pieces. But what I want you guys to notice though is on the inside, there is a place for your marble to run.
But like, won't it fall out?
Velocity. You're gonna have to figure out where the best place for that loop is to make sure that your marble has enough speed to get through the whole loop. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, you guys have to talk to each other and problem solve and compromise. get started on drawing your designs. One of the things that has come up this year in teaching students with a wide range of skills is making sure that my lesson plans are very thoughtful to all the students. It's collaborating with the special education team, with the other gen ed teachers to see what's going on in their classes and how we can do things cross-curricular, or how we can make sure that we're hitting all the marks for all of our students. I was working with our special education teacher to plan groups for the roller coaster project. What we were talking about and discussed, making the groups accessible to all the students. So planning specifically for students with disabilities, with IEPs, with 504s. The idea for this particular activity was a lot for the kinesthetic learners and for the auditory learners, because they have to talk and describe their ideas. And then there's also those students who work really well in groups and just learning from their peers with a wide range of skills.
We gotta figure out how to get it looped. How did we get it to work the first time? It was bigger!
So what I see for the general ed students is a lot of tolerance, acceptance. I see them being more thoughtful in their interactions. What I see for students with disabilities or IEPs or 504s are that they're beginning to realize that even in a generalized classroom, they can be successful in science or in math or in language arts or social studies.
There! Ah, it fell. That worked.
Madeline, it's your turn.
I know the children need us. That's the most important thing. The children in the Mississippi Delta can learn just as well as any other children in the U.S., but their experiences and exposures are very limited. We are one of the highest when it comes to illnesses of diabetes and other health in the state. The median income status here for Sunflower County is around approximately $19,000 a year. And that's not a whole lot. Y'all have a good day. At James C. Rosser, we believe in a vision that all children will work together to build a community of dedicated and productive citizens. They know that we are here as a team, and they know that we have to take ownership of whatever our data says, because it belongs to us. They know that all of our job is that we want to see all of our students grow. Good morning, Madeline. How are you? You been sick?
Ms. Wilkins will get that later. Okay, good.
I want her to be in that class with the regular kids, the kids that can talk, because she's learning the same thing that they are learning. And I don't want, even though she's kind of behind with her speech, I don't want her to be that much behind being in a different class. So I want her to stay with the kids in her age group, because they also help her too. She sees stuff they do and she want to do it. She come home always pick up a book because she see the kids pick up a book and read, and she try to read to me.
The most important thing in inclusion is not money. It is the teacher's experience, the resources that we already have in the classroom, and making sure that we have differentiated instruction for students. Okay, so these are the words that we're learning this week. Now, who wants to spell this word? Madeline, it's your time. Madeline keeps me on my toes, because Madeline is one of those students I know from the start that she gives me something different every day. Give Madeline a hand. Good job, Madeline. All eyes on me. And what I noticed is that she gets along well at every table. So she's able to work with every student. I even find that they even do scaffolding for her, even at their age. They know what to work with her on, and they encourage her to do well.
Well, my son Denver does not have a disability, but he does have a child in the classroom with a disability. Yes, it's very positive because he comes home and say, Mom, what can I do to help Manly? Mom, what can I do to help her do this?
She's just a normal, perfect child to me. And I love the way she is accomplishing because I thought that she wasn't going to be able to do it. I'm glad I didn't put her in a separate class, that she's in a normal class. I just hope her speech get better and she do as good as I did in school as far as graduating and going to college and everything.
Write your name, madam.
I'm going to let her choose what she want to do, but I'm going to push her as far as to go to college. Yes, I will.
How many of y'all got so far? I had 9 so far on the practices side. I got 5-ish, if you round up 6, on the MTSS component side. Keep going with your list, and as you make your list, pick your top 3 in each column.
Planning time is crucial.
And this is something that we may want to add in, like pre-filled in sentences.
This is my first year co-teaching. This is Molly Albany's first year in 8th grade. So we've been really able to grow together and plan together to build our classroom.
They need to be able to interpret from a graph, at least the solution point.
Planning time is crucial. To be able to sit down and really talk through what lessons need to be done, what concepts need to be addressed, and how we're going to address it. Which students need accommodations, which students need modifications. If you are teaching collaboratively and you barely know each other, then that comes across to students. And when you can plan together and build that relationship, you end up with a much more cohesive classroom where students know that you are a partnership.
I just want to review. If you're given slope and y-intercept, if you're given standard form, if you're given a
Jen has more of the math background with things, and I have the special ed background, so she'll tell me, she'll run by me what she's thinking, and then knowing what the students' needs are, I then take it and figure out, okay, how do I have to go about adapting what we're going to do in class for the different students so that they're all learning the same material, but maybe in different ways. This is your X, this is your Y, this is your M. Jacob is a student with autism, and he also has some attention needs.
Jacob, we're gonna, okay, 10:05, but you need to use the clock. You don't need to use the computer. One of the reasons Jacob is finding so much success and having so much progress is because we were giving him more responsibility, and he's learning that he can handle that responsibility. I think in the past it was maybe taken for granted maybe that he would need someone on him all the time, constantly telling him what to do, and we're finding that he doesn't need that. I like to float around, and I like to work with as many students as possible because, first of all, I don't want Jacob to feel, or any student that I'm working with to feel that I'm just there for them and that they're kind of singled out. And I want every kid in that classroom also to be comfortable coming to me for anything. I absolutely think that if I was next to him all the time, it would be a barrier. It would kind of hinder his progress with social action with other students.
Okay, so put 1 underneath of it.
Segregating autistic students, that's the most dumbest and pathetic excuse that I can ever think of. Because they want to get along with the other classmates. It's just like segregation and apartheid. And if this was ever like an autistic school that would be segregated from just a normal school, I would probably feel very sad.
Sounds good. See you later. Bye, Mr. Deacons. Bye, Jacob.
My family has been in this community for over 100 years. My dad graduated from this very school building in 1946. My fear was that he was going to be someone that was going to have to be guided and directed his entire life, and that's not the case. I believe he's going to make a difference in this world. And my hopes and dreams are that he has a happy and productive life.
Every single person.
We have been learning about the controversy surrounding whether or not the United States should open its doors to the Syrian refugees. What are some of the reasons we already know about that are justifications for yes, accepting additional refugees, or no, refusing additional refugees?
There could be possible terrorists hiding in there.
Some people think they're innocent.
the states might not know what to do about with like settling them?
It's because it's the right thing to do.
The students who are mainstreamed into my classroom this year are mainstreamed for the first time in their academic careers, some of them, and a couple of them have profound cognitive impairments. Your job next is to actually learn what is the process. If you feel like reading today, go for the Time magazine article. If you'd rather listen today, go for the NPR article, all right? You get to choose. I think it's really important for schools that are working on implementing the SWIFT model to think about what does every single person in the building have to contribute to make that model work. Fortunately, the paraprofessionals who I work with and Miss Lee are all highly flexible people and highly supportive people.
Even though I'm a speech pathologist, my philosophy is trying to sort of make it a blurrier line in terms of my role in the school, because I think I have strengths other than just being a speech language pathologist. So I think co-teaching allows me to use my professional strengths as well as my personal strengths to support all kids. When I used to pull kids out, I noticed that I was teaching something in isolation, and the kids that I was pulling out have a hard time generalizing skills anyway, and so when they'd go back to the classroom, they wouldn't use those skills. This way, I know more about what's going on in the classroom, and so I can help support my kids with what they're actually doing instead of working on something separate.
Let's get some hands of folks who haven't had a chance to speak yet today. Everybody's voice should be in this space at least once during the day.
I learned that half of the refugees that have come in are over 60 and the other half are children.
Who has at least 3 steps in the process? There's really only so far that I can go on my own. That aspect of collaboration and getting insight and getting that reflection is just invaluable. For students who historically have not been in gen ed classrooms, there's no way I can do it without that collaboration.
Make people feel valued.
The district was a chronically failing school district. In addition to that, the United States Department of Justice was in the process of pending a lawsuit for allegations of the school district running a school-to-prison pipeline. The Meridian Public School District is currently 90% minority, are African-American males. Statistically, a large portion of that population are at risk, and we want to garner any tools we can use to help us to save as many of our African-American males as we can. The research shows that if we can get them to the 10th and 11th grade, that their chances of graduating jumps to 80-90%. I think at the district level, what we've done is worked on building capacity within our leaders and our teachers. So many times we ask our teachers to meet the needs of these students, but we don't give them the tools to do so.
Relationships play an important key factor in having a positive culture and climate. So in that case, I'm talking about relationships, of course, with colleagues to colleagues, teacher to students, teacher to parents, all stakeholders, because here at West Hill, all means all.
Okay, so today we're going to divide with decimals, okay? Remember in lesson 7.
I'm a worship leader. Sunday morning, most of the children and parents know me from the community, from singing at different things in the area. So it comes natural.
So let's do the movements. Ready? Everybody show me divide. Show me multiply. Show me subtract. Bring down. Then we do what? Check it out. And that's when we do the what? Inverse operation. All right, so y'all got that pretty good, okay?
I learned through music, movement, writing, drawing, whatever it is, that's how I learn. So I like to incorporate that into the classroom.
With each step, when you open it up,
that's fine.
You're going to find the next step, okay? So right where it says multiply, you're going to see the multiplication part of it, okay? That looks really good, right?
All of the things that we implemented as far as SWIFT, everybody do what they can. I mean, it's not a me attitude, it's a we attitude. Let's get it done, and that's what we do.
The divisor.
So my door is always open to my parents because you must make people feel valued. And once you do that, you have them. You can build strong, long-lasting relationships, and that's what I'm all about.
What's next?
1.
Last one?
2.
Brilliant. Absolutely, 1 in each box.
Through the course of 5 years, hard work, we've been able to increase the morale with faculty and staff, with relationships, rapport, as well as with our parent involvement.
We've gone from having 70% of the schools failing to no failing schools. So for the first time in over a decade, we're proud to say that no child in the city of Meridian attends a failing school.
Lily belongs.
All right, everyone has a worksheet. Number 1, we have all been convinced by others to buy or do things. Who on the list below usually is best at convincing you? Who is second?
Every student has the right to receive instruction with our age-appropriate peers in a general education setting, and it is our job to figure it out. It's not the student's job to figure it out. It's the adult's job to figure it out. And it's hard sometimes. It's all the adults are the ones that get in the way, right? It's not the kids. The kids don't ever get in the way. The kids live up to your expectations. So if you expect them to be peers with each other, they're peers with each other.
How do you think respect plays a role in someone being able to persuade you? Lily, what do you think? Do you think it's easy?
Easy.
So you think you could convince Jackson to give you his last piece of gum? No? But you guys are good friends, aren't you?
Yep.
Yep, that's what I thought. Okay.
You sit right here. Lily wants you to. Lily says she wants people that she wants.
I think Lily belongs in our classroom because she is wonderful and she likes to make friends and she is nice to everybody. She respects everybody around her. She respects the teachers, she respects her things, and it shows us. Like, she's like a role model for us.
You have a good day. And you are the guardians. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we would have had it any other way, right? I mean, it's just socially, she's just another kid in the crowd, which is a really big deal for us, right?
This is my 3rd year teaching, and I think before this year and working with Lily and some other students in my class with these severe disabilities, I probably would have said there is a separate place for some students to learn, but I really honestly feel that general education setting is the place for all students to learn. I feel like not only do they benefit from being together with their peers, but I think the peers really benefit from that as well.
Well, I met her first last year in math class. She was at a different table and I thought, oh, maybe I can meet a new friend because I'm not really that social, but she's just really funny and it's good to be friends with her.
It's hard to explain, but with that problem that we're doing on the board, when she does that and I can help her with that, it helps me understand more about what we're doing.
I try to modify things where it doesn't look any different for her. So I really like using the Chromebooks. If everyone else is, working on an assignment that is short answer or maybe even essay, I can create something for her on the Chromebook that's multiple choice or fill in the blank, or she could speak to the text and it could type it for her. But if you were to come in the classroom and look, it looks the same to everyone. I think it builds her self-confidence. She fits in with everyone, which is awesome.
Good morning. Welcome back, Jules. How you feeling? I think we're all trying every day to do what's best for kids, and it really is. It's just a learning process.
Okay, do you want to come up?
I think just having them in the general education classroom isn't the answer. Learning next to each other isn't the same thing as learning with each other.
Okay, so
is it challenging? Sometimes it's really challenging. Sometimes we struggle with how to do it, and sometimes we don't get it right, and we have to seek additional support to make it right. My mantra every day is if it's good for kids. And if it's good for kids, I can stand by it and I can support it. And if it's not good for kids, then we have to come up with something else.
Everyone plays a part.
So I actually teach an elective that's drumming and songwriting. The model of the class is in a circle. So everyone, including the teachers, are kind of on the same level, and everyone plays a part in the music that we play. Chad is definitely the leader, but when we perform and play together, everyone plays a part, including the teachers.
I wanted people to understand that there was traditions in this community, African American traditions in this community, cultural traditions that should be honored and respected. And at the same time, we found that lots of kids who were in these special ed classes were also star drummers. So it was a big revelation of like, there's more talent that we haven't been reaching.
It's very kinesthetic, it's very hands-on. Kids are playing the rhythms, they're playing together, and it's just this inclusive, circular environment that really opens up every kid to be a part of it.
Everybody, bring your friends. Mufiamo que yo aba, guayo wacho palo go. Everybody, bring your friends. All your friends. Mufiamo que yo aba, guayo wacho palo go.
All right. Get ready. Pick 3 inclusive practices, pick 3 MTSS components, and you can pick them on your way to meeting your new partner. I want you to walk across the room to somebody you don't know and share 1 practice and 1 component. Then walk to somebody else, share another practice and another component. And then to a third person, share a third practice and a third component. This is an engage at your comfort level activity. If you're not all that social, like one of the girls in the video, maybe push yourself for just 1 interaction. But I'm going to hold a high bar for you. I think you can do this. For those of you who are feeling not so confident, I was not the person who said I'm an expert at MTSS. I'm not sure that my components are right. That's okay. We won't tell. We're all learning this together. Take your best guess at what you think a component of MTSS is. All right, I'm going to put 3 minutes on the clock, 1 minute per pairing. In 3 minutes, share 3 practices and 3 components with 3 different people. It's a 3-fer, go for it. All right, come back to your seats. You all are good sharers. You jumped right in. Most impressive. Okay, so we're talking about the what. Let's talk about what we're thinking behind the what. Those improved outcomes. From what I've said thus far, what are you anticipating the benefits of inclusive practices in MTSS to be? So if you turn to the next page, what do you think the benefits are going to be of inclusive practices and MTSS? Start predicting. And while you predict and discuss at your table, we will also transition into a break. So I'm going to put 12 minutes on the clock, and you can distribute those 12 minutes however you would like for some table talk, some anticipation, and a little get up and move time. So we will restart again in 12 minutes, and we will dive deep into some direct instruction, yay, on benefits of inclusive practices and MTSS. All right, so let's get back to the benefits. You were doing a little benefit anticipation before I left. I did want to just point out one inclusive practice that I saw that can be applied in a different way. It builds from the same theme, though. That closing song of "Everybody bring your friends, bring all your friends," actually can become a tool for taking a look at social relationships and the impact of our instruction school-wide. Imagine having everybody in your class, everybody in your grade, everybody in your school write down people with whom they have social relationships. They may not be best of friends, but they've got some connection. Each student makes a list of the kids with whom they have some kind of connection. You gather up the lists and you compare it to your class roster, grade roster, school roster, and you find out who's got connections and whose doesn't. If there's a name that doesn't show up from the school roster on that connections list of kids in your school, you've got something to target. On the behavioral, social, and emotional side, we know that that increases the likelihood of behavioral, social, and emotional well-being if kids have connections. And on the academic side, we know that it's going to enhance our academic instruction if we've got some connection to build from. So we can actually flip that over to actually be a purposeful probe on what's happening as a result, as an effect of what we're doing school-wide, which leads into a benefit. So, oops, I'm clicking away and it's not happening here. So let's talk a little bit about that transition from PBIS to RTI to MTSS in terms of the benefit side of the conversation, because we've been tracking these benefits for a while, and they've been growing and emerging for a while in the field. Now, these are slides that are not in your handout, and it's going to be okay because there's about 10 slides that all make the same exact points and they fit into the graph of benefits in your activity guide. They're just my visual reminders of what to say. So early on, when we had that evolving practice to address school-wide PBIS, a lot of us were introduced to the triangle world. For those of you who have some experience and knowledge and history with tiered instructional approaches, we've seen a lot of triangles in our day. And one of the first ones was around behavioral systems, where we talked about universal interventions for all kids with the anticipation that 80 to 90% of our population would respond to the universal intervention. Right? It wasn't 80 to 90% of them get them. That percentage was the percentage who would respond to that intervention. And then some kids, 5 to 10%, would need a little something extra in order to meet the expectations that we had. So we'd add on a little something more in order to help you get to those behavioral expectations. So we may have school-wide agreed upon core set of 3 to 5 expectations for all kids. We might matrix those to say, here's what that looks like in the classroom, in the hallway, in the lunchroom, outside. And we teach then, too, what those look-fors are in our building. And some kids get it on the first round through, and sometimes we've got to add on a little something extra. Some kids, we've done some screening, we're finding out, you know, this kiddo's getting 5 office discipline referrals within the first 2 months of school. This kiddo's probably at a higher risk for something else going on this year. So maybe we're going to add on a little check-in, check-out procedure, a little teach, check, and connect. For that student, give them a little something more than just the reteach on the major expectations. So we start adding on based on our predictions for risk and our response to instruction. We want that to be a rapid, high-efficiency approach. And then we acknowledged in this model that there were going to be a small percentage of the population, a few students, who would need something much more intensive, which may include all the way up to full wraparound, engagement with external agencies, functional behavioral assessments, to really guide a very targeted, very specific behavioral intervention and support plan for students that we would then carry out all day long, right? So if you were getting intensive interventions, we acknowledged that that probably went down here and changed what we were doing in here for you as well to make sure that you were supported. We also started to do that on the RTI academic side. Same flow of events. We had a bucket of universal interventions proactively, preventatively, taking a look at what was happening for students. We would do these all-school universal screeners in reading and math. And in high school, we'd be looking at our predictors for success in high school and be determining, are you at risk? Let me get in there early for you. But we would first deliver that high-quality core instruction, and we would anticipate 80 to 90% of our population would get it through that high-quality first best instruction, and then we'd be adding on. So if I did my universal screener and you got flagged for a little bit of risk, I'd probably be putting in some extra doses of those core content areas as needed. I might be pulling some kids into groups to do what I would call supplemental instruction and targeted interventions. Some kiddos we would see need just a little extra dose of what already happened once, a little reteach, and some kids would need some specific skill intervention. Right? So in the area of reading, I'm not doing so well with my vocabulary, and neither is this table, so the 5 of us come together and we're getting a little specific targeted skill work in the area of vocab development. And then some kids we would see would need much more intensive support. right? So I'm reading 2 grades off level. I'm in your 5th grade class. That means you're adapting your text down here for me, and you're saying, out of all the skills we could work on in reading, here's the things that Michael needs in order to make the next best leap for him in his reading development. We're asking the question at that level, what's preventing Michael from reading at the next level up in reading? So we're doing some diagnostic assessments for Tier 3 work to really focus us in, right? It's not like, let's just give him an extra hour of broad reading instruction. Let's just throw the book at him. It's actually saying what part of this is really the thing that we can invest in for him that will bump him up to the next level. Right? Maybe that vocab, working with words, it may be language stuff. Maybe I come from some really limited life experiences and I need more background knowledge. I need to understand the schemas of narrative text, informational text. Maybe the big thing that's holding me back is print processing. I'm really having a hard time just putting it all together. My fluency is not where it needs to be. My accuracy is great, but my fluency is not. So what's the thing that's really holding me back? Right? And we were doing these in little buckets, side by side, right? I can see you do behavioral work over there, but I'm doing math work over here, right? And the twain shall never meet. Then we said, okay, well, let's at least get them in closer proximity to one another. So we moved the triangles together. We said that should do it. And then we discovered that's not doing it. We've got to look more at integrating these together. And so another way to convey that imagery is to actually see our students moving through these tiers of support. At the core, as we brought PBIS and RTI together, at the core, we still had a common belief, a kind of common guiding principle about what we were doing in our schools. And that was to say, not all kids respond to the same level or resource allocation when it comes to support. Some kids require a different resource allocation, a different kind of support in order to respond. So we have amount of resources needed for that benefit on one axis, and we have severity of educational need on the other axis. Severity of educational need could be, I'm a struggling reader, I'm a struggling scientist. It could be, I'm gifted and talented in that, and I need greater challenge. So need can be on either end of that when we talk about that part of the axis. Can I jump into your picture? But all kids still are starting off by getting that Tier 1 instruction. And we're doing our screening 3 times a year, beginning of the year, because again, we want to predict, are you possibly at risk? So we're going to do that within the first couple of months of school. Then I'm going to do it again around January to kind of figure out now, okay, she's showing some risk. Let me get proactive, not wait for you to fail, right? And then again at the end of the year to try to get another measure. 3 times a year we're doing screening of all of our kiddos. And we're doing that in academics and in behavior now. And then we're actually putting those 2 data sources together to figure out what's going on. Because I might show that I've got needs in all areas, but there's an underlying thing going on that's at the root of both my academic and behavioral challenges. And we're going to get to that graphic in just a moment. So I'm looking at that data for all my kids, and then I'm figuring out who needs something a little extra. Ooh, they moved. So fun. Some kids need a little extra. So I'm trying to figure out what that is, and sometimes that looks like a lot of diagnostic teaching, right? Like, best guess, I'm going to get in there quickly and do something, and we're going to figure out what's responding. And sometimes we've got a kind of template of go-to things that we try out, check in, check out on the behavior side, these interventions in reading or math, right, that I'm going to first and foremost, best next guess. But if I'm giving you something extra, I'm then also monitoring your progress and your response to that at least 2 times a month, once a month, depends on the group that you're working with, depends on the school you're in and what your school-wide framework says. Now, for some kiddos, we do that screening. We look at the historical data. You know, Jack shows up with his big file. And we say, all right, we know he's going to need something more intensive, so let's just jump there right now. Let's not wait. We don't have to wait 3 months. We've had him for 4 years. We know something intensive has to happen for Jack. So let's take a look at what that is. And if we're putting those supports in place, now we're monitoring weekly. We're We're monitoring every single week to see how he's responding. So as we up the level of support, we're upping the frequency that we're monitoring the response to the supports that we're providing. In addition to. So you'll see the plus signs here. These are all in addition to. For some schools, it meant you got tier 1 plus tier 2 plus tier 3. Different content areas. Sometimes it was +1 plus 3, and 3 included some stuff from 2. So it flexed. There were different schools, different states that had different models, but this was the basic flow that we were going through. In tier 1, we were using our data to inform our differentiation, to inform our universal design, right? We take our best guess at designing for learner variability. We build our curriculum and instruction approaches with that in mind. What's going on in our local neighborhood? Do I have a lot of Amish students? Do I have a lot of kids from poverty? What does that inform me for my design of my curriculum and instruction? So I'm going to do good design work up front, and then you find out they're human, and we have to shift and adapt, right? Sometimes on the spot, sometimes based on a pattern that we hadn't predicted, and we use that to inform changes in content, in process, in product, of our instructional delivery, of our materials that we're using. So that data is informing tier 1. That data is informing tier 2. We've got our kids now into some set groups where we're providing instruction and intervention, right? So tier 2, this might be that supplemental instruction, more of the good stuff from the green zone. And these might be specific content area interventions. And then we look to see what's the response to that. So for some kiddos, as I've provided my interventions and I'm monitoring what's going on, I see, you know what, we've got really good response from those kiddos. Look at that, they just drop right back into tier 1. Right? Other kiddos, we say, you know, this entire intervention group showed no response to instruction. Let's imagine that maybe that wasn't about the kids. Maybe we weren't delivering those interventions very well. Maybe we got to wrap around those teachers and take a look at whether or not we're delivering things as intended, right? So I'm going to look at fidelity here data. I'm maybe going to provide a little bit more coaching for the interventionists working with that group. And then for other kids, I see, well, these kids in different groups didn't show the level of response. So what am I going to do? Am I going to adjust those interventions? Am I going to move kids up to greater levels of support? Am I going to switch them out to a different interventionist? Is it because she didn't get along with her very well in this group and they were just ticking each other off every single day and that was what was distracting from the academic intervention? So I'm going to move some kiddos around. Maybe I'm going to move some interventionists around. And some kiddos I'm going to put up for tier 3 support, right? So we get into tier 3, same data, same database decision-making that's going on with different data sets and different frequency of that data set. So some kids, I look at their data, I can move their support levels down in a particular content area. Other kiddos, I'm taking a look again, do I have a group level intervention issue? So I'm going to pay attention to fidelity of delivery for this group, or do I have other kiddos who need to get adjusted and moved around for different supports? It's a flexible system as we're going through it. So we go back to that big picture and we see all kids are getting tier 1, and then as we respond to the data that's coming in that's letting us know if kids are responding to our instruction interventions, we're moving them around accordingly. Let's get into some of the benefits then that we expect from that and that we've got documented thus far. So there are lots of benefits broadly that have been documented over the years for inclusive practices, and now inclusive practices in the context of a multi-tiered system of support. We've got about 40 years of research that shows us that kids with disabilities educated in general education settings make better academic progress, reading and math scores particularly, that have been monitored in the research, and behavioral, social, emotional well-being, decreases in office discipline referrals as an example. Greater social skills as an example. No study in 40 years has shown greater outcomes for kids with severe disabilities when they're educated in separate placements. Not one study in 40 years has shown greater benefit to separate specialized instruction for kids with the most significant disabilities. Just a note. There it is. So in an era of evidence-based practice, I know we let go of whole reading instruction on a little bit of a smaller evidence base. And yet across the country still, the majority of kids with significant disabilities are educated in separate settings. And the evidence doesn't support it. It may be because that's what we know to do, but the research isn't supporting it. So we've got to raise some questions there about that. How many of you know John Hattie's work? A couple of you. So he's an Aussie who spends his time looking at research summaries, and then he's put together the summaries of the research to make new summaries to say what's really effective. Because not all teaching is created equal. And what he helped us do by looking at summaries of research summaries and compiling them together is to say, if we look across all these summaries of summaries in my new summary, we find out that some teaching, as it shows up in the research, has less effect, and some teaching seems to have higher effect when it comes to student outcomes. Not news to most of you in this room, but he gave us a nifty tool, a little barometer of effectiveness, for us to kind of make it more visual for ourselves. So some things that we're doing actually seem to have a negative effect on kids' outcomes, particularly in the area of academic achievement. Some things that we do have what we would call a developmental effect. Like if I had just let Holly get a little bit older, she would have come to this on her own. Other things have a typical teacher effect, like average teaching would have this effect. So if I expose Kimberly to reading, that will have kind of a typical average effect. So let's take a look at those. If we're getting above a 0.40, however, on this scale, that's our zone of desired effects. We want to do the stuff that's really going to get the bang for the buck. So over here at a 0.90, we have formative evaluation. And he looked at not just direct instructional strategies with kids, but also school-wide factors. And this is one of those factors. If we engage teachers in formative evaluation, where they're reflecting on their practices and they're looking to see what has the higher effect, under what conditions, for which content areas, for which time of the year, we get teachers who start having a higher effect on their kiddos' outcomes. If we take a look at retention, we find out that retention actually has a reverse effect on outcomes. We can make things worse for you by holding you back. That's what the research is telling us. Typical teacher effects, exposure to reading, the Kimberly example I just gave to you. Now, if we look at response to instruction, response to intervention, and the research on that, where we've looked to answer the question, is it being done with fidelity? Not just am I telling you I'm doing RTI, but there are essential components that are in place that show I'm actually implementing response to intervention. We see a 1.07 effect size. So the large-scale research on response to instruction, response to intervention is showing high effect as a school-wide practice. So we're interested in that. Right? That's part of the benefit for our kids with and without disabilities, is we can have higher effect on their achievement if we use this school-wide tiered instructional model. In fact, our work in SWIFT has taken a look, and this is not in your slides, it's okay, it's just going to be a brief point. Our work in SWIFT is showing us that if we have a fidelity measure that looks at whether or not you're implementing MTSS or the components of our framework, and that's what this score at the bottom shows, and we relate it to your reading and math scores that you get from statewide accountability assessments, and in this case we looked at the states that are using PARC, and we looked at the level of implementation of our framework, we see the more you get implemented, the more you get down to that end, the more you can predict reading achievement will increase. There are a couple of exceptions within that, and we're now wanting to study those exceptions. But on the whole, we're seeing that implementation status is a predictor of reading scores on that state accountability measure. We found the same thing in math with our first sets of schools in our PARC states. If you were doing it with greater fidelity, you could predict greater math scores. So then we said, well, let's take a look at our schools that are Title I. So if we look at higher poverty contexts, does that change? And what we found, consistent with all that RTI research that Hattie was boiling down, we saw, again, a positive relationship. The more you did it with fidelity, the more you could predict higher reading achievement for your kiddos. And in that case, we looked at the SBAC state, Smarter Balanced Assessment. We found that for reading and for math. We are also interested in, at the time that we're creating that academic excellence, are we promoting a sense of inclusion and equity? So we said, let's track the kiddos who are on alternate assessments, those kids with the most significant disabilities. Are we at the same time shifting where they're getting their education? And in fact, across our schools, in these first 2 years, we don't have this year's data all summarized yet, so this is just from the first 2 years of technical assistance. We're seeing a pretty significant increase from about 19% to about 32% of our kids in our buildings who are on alternate assessments are spending 80% or more of their time in general education. That's well above the national averages across our country. And to get that rate of change is actually significantly faster than the last 10 years of what we've been doing in schools. We've kind of flatlined on moving this population into general ed settings in the last 10 years. And what our data shows is we can bump that back up if we take this school-wide framework and link it with tiered approaches to instruction. So we're seeing the corresponding decrease of kids getting educated in separate settings. We also care not that you're physically in the room, but that you're participating in that core reading and math instruction. So we had local educators track, not only is the kid with significant disabilities physically in the room, are they engaged in your instruction during core reading and core math, just as beginning measures. And what we've seen over the course of 3 years is that we've more than doubled the participation of students on alternate assessments in core reading and math instruction, the general ed classroom instruction. So they're not just physically in, they're engaged. So like that Jack story, in year 1, he was kind of physically in the room but getting something really different. And by year 2, he was engaged and suddenly we saw different kinds of learning from him. We're trying to see if we can set that up for a larger scale of students with a larger scale effort if we take a school-wide model. So those are some benefits. Moving into the general ed environment, getting access to general curriculum for kids with disabilities. We're seeing increases in reading and math achievement across the board. Another benefit to MTSS, and I believe this slide is in your packet, we can prevent kids from having extra challenges. We're finding that some kids have combined academic and behavioral challenges. The work of McIntosh and Steve Goodman, I believe one of the books that's being handed out today. You can read up on this over the weekend now that you have the book. We're seeing some kids start off having some kind of behavioral reaction that's interfering with their academic instruction, and thus it results in them having less access to that general academic instruction. So I act out in Kylie's class, and she's like, great, go to the office, right? I've just decreased access to that instruction. Now I do it again on day 2 and day 3 and day 4, and now I'm in and out of school suspension, and I've been out for 2 weeks, and now I'm 2 weeks behind academically. So our adult response to the behavioral interference has now resulted in an academic problem that then spirals. We've got another path to these combined academic and behavioral challenges around attention. Right? So I'm a guy with ADHD, like you didn't notice. And squirrel. And for me, there's always that kind of notion of like, well, is he going to be on today or is he going to be off today? And people who contract with me to present are always wondering, will he have a good day or will he have a bad day? So it can affect my social relationships. My shifting attention can be really hyper-focused at times, and then other times, not so much. Right? So I can be really with you in instruction and then look out the window, isn't that pretty? Right? And then I'm back. Or I'm looking at you like I'm engaged, but I'm making huge other lists in my head. Right? I've got shifting attention, which has an impact on my social and academic engagement. So I kind of present with both right from the beginning, but depending on the day, it shows up in one or the other, combined academic and behavioral challenges. If I've got a tiered system for providing support to people like myself within the school-wide, I'm more ready to respond to individuals' needs. There's a slower path here to combined challenge, and that is you start off with some kind of an academic challenge. So I'm really struggling in this math class, and my peers are noticing that I'm struggling. And it's affecting my peer relationships, right? We know that kiddo in our class who gets some social rejection because they're not performing at the same level as other kiddos in the class. We also know that as teachers, sometimes we show that struggle on our face. As hard as we try to keep it deep inside and not let anybody know, I'm noticing that you're struggling. And you're noticing that I'm noticing that you're struggling. And the noticing of each other's struggle here is now creating some social rejection for you from me as your teacher. A little slower path now, but now wouldn't you know, I've got some embedded social emotional challenges where now I'm just anxious thinking about going to math class. Never mind actually being there. Right? Now I've got some ongoing anxiety stuff that's coming up for me every single day. Started off as an academic challenge. So I need an approach that's going to allow me to talk about both at the same time. Final pathway here, academic challenges that can result and relate with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. Right? So over here we start off with behavior that interfered with the academic instruction, and over here we're starting off with the academic issue. I hate math, I start ripping pages out of the book, throwing the book at the teacher, and now what started off as an academic issue, I'm really frustrated in math, is now becoming a behavioral issue, right? You didn't have to show me that you were struggling with my response to instruction. I knew it all on my own, and I'm having a hard time now, right? So we started off with an academic issue, now we've got a behavioral issue. 4 different pathways to having a combined academic and behavioral challenge. We know these kids are in our schools. We need a school-wide model that's going to allow us to be in both conversations at the same time. So the benefit for kids with and without identified disabilities is that we can actually have whole child conversations in our school with whole child data and have a system to be able to tap into before it gets really bad. We can get proactive about that if we have this school-wide model. Oh good, I did put these in there too. So these next slides I've stolen from George Sugai, who does a lot of work with the National PBIS Center. And it's just another visual way to convey this notion of MTSS and to point to some of the benefits. So as he talks about the continuum of support for all students, going from this universal system of support for all kids that everybody's getting, and then targeting our supports in for some kids and giving intensive supports to a few kids, he allows us to kind of map out any individual student's profile, right? Because I may not need Tier 3 social emotional support all the time. My attention is shifting, and thus the supports would need to be shifting. So this kind of framework allows us to flex the supports, right? So as I look at Wendy, and she's getting Tier 3 support in a particular content area, that doesn't make Wendy a Tier 3 kid all the time. It means she's getting Tier 3 support in that content area, right? This isn't about labeling her a new way. It's about mapping out the supports for her. So in Theora's case, Theora's doing pretty well in basketball and technology and social studies. Right? Our typical differentiation seems to be accommodating her support needs there. But then we get to other areas like decoding and comprehension, and she needs a little bit more differentiation. It doesn't necessarily need skill-specific work, but she needs a little bit more differentiation and attention from us. But when we get up to math and science, there's some foundational stuff that's not in place for her that we're having to still build up. She doesn't need that Tier 3 support in all areas. Right? So it's not a Tier 3 kid. Right? She needs Tier 3 supports in what area? Under what conditions does she need that level of intensive supports? So a benefit for Theora and her family is that they also have a clearer understanding of how to be supporting and supportive to her. Right? So when she brings home her math and science homework, they know as parents, I got to get to the table and be with her for this. Right? I'm not just kind of say, go to your room and do your homework. Well, she needs a little bit more than that when it comes to this. So I'm going to engage mom and dad in conversations about what's the best support for Theora at home to get that work done, right? Maybe share some of the strategies that we're using in school that are helpful to her. So I'm strengthening that conversation, which is decreasing occurrences of Theora not doing her homework at home, which is increasing her positive relationships with her parents. I'm probably also engaging mom and dad to just keep sending Theora really positive messages about school, that math and science can be frustrating, and this is a hard unit that we're in right now, and that we're going to all work together to get her through this. For Malcolm, the supports are really different. The most intensive supports he needs are around anger management and problem solving, regardless of content area. But he doesn't need that support for all things all the time, right? So cooperative play, homework, interacting with peers, absolutely fine. Where does the academic and problem solving show up? When he's dealing with adults. Okay, so we don't need that support when he's with his peers, but when he's interacting with adults, as an example. So we want to be very specific in describing that more intensive support so that we don't over-support kids and that we're allocating our resources directed to their greatest needs. And I've shared with you George's blank profile here because I've actually used this to sit down and have the conversation with family members and with other teachers to say, let's kind of map out what we think we know about Gail. Where is she doing fine, doesn't need our attention, but where do we need to really kind of better differentiate and or wrap around Gail? All right, take a moment at your tables and see what you can summarize regarding academics, behavior, and generally speaking for children with and without disabilities, educators, and families based on what you've got so far for information. At your tables, do some cross-sharing. If you don't have all your boxes filled in, see who does and see if what they've got is any good to put on your sheet. Give you a couple minutes to do that summarizing. I'm going to walk across the room and have tables call out benefits. If you hear the other side of the room call out a benefit that you already have, just put a little check. Offer up something new. We'll stop for each table and I'll just kind of weave in and out.
Oh, we're not ready.
So I'll start in the back. Yes. A benefit. Provide specific areas and targeted supports. Great example. Another benefit.
Integrated thinking.
Integrated thinking.
All kids achieve.
All kids achieve.
It's more collaborative.
More collaborative. Peer interaction, nice save. You four?
Ditto.
Ditto. Going to participate at the level you can. It's all good.
We had learning from all.
Learning from all.
Learning to problem solve together, both kids problem solving together and...
Ooh, problem solving together for kids and adults. I like that. Nice one. Ditto? Yeah. Ditto. Excellent.
We said it informs families, educators, and students.
Informs educators, families, and students. Nice.
Peer modeling.
Peer modeling. Great. Increased diversity. A sense of community. High expectations for learning. Ditto. Okay. And those are the staff members who've been with me for 5 days this week hearing this spiel. All righty. Tier 2 coming your way. Okay. Questions about the benefits. So that was not a full debrief of the benefits because I want to leave something for you to talk about over lunch with each other. Okay. Let's get into action. So as Angela transitions down here, let me begin to give you the directions for this next activity called a trio. It's going to require you both moving your chairs and bringing your activity guide and your pen with you. I know, it's a lot at once here. We're going to invite you to take 3 chairs and form a very tight grouping where 3 people could sit together and have a conversation. We're going to construct these. We, as you are able, are going to help construct these around the room. Now the back row, because you're so close to the wall, we're going to do the line across for chairs just between the back row and the next row in. Right? So down the sides, across the front, and across that middle row there. If you understand the general layout that I'm talking about, give me a thumbs up. If we see enough of those, you can scaffold and support the other people who are just staring at me like, you want me to do what? Okay. So, with purpose, grab a chair, create a trio in the outer circle. And then I'm going to hand it over to Angela. You've got your components from your trio there. Let's now kind of take yet one more look at another visual organizer. It's our latest visual organizer from the Swift Center for thinking about multi-tiered system of support for all kids across all areas. And the visual we use is this, where we think about addressing academic, behavioral, and social emotional learning in a fully integrated system of support. And so, how do those components of the system come together? So we think about something that all students are going to experience in terms of this universal support. So all students are getting that first best instruction across academics, behavior, social emotional learning. Some students are getting something with additional support to enhance that response to instruction from the universal. While we keep in this kind of space between the two, that's really for conversation purposes. That's not because it's now a completely separate system. We view this very much as a continuum for all kids and a continuum of support. And then a few students are going to need something much more intensive in addition to that, and it's going to be intensified support across the whole day. In the center there, you're seeing some key colors and words that I want to point out. First of all, we apply universal design for learning across the whole system, academics, behavior, social, emotional learning. We want to think about multiple options for presentation, response, and engagement at every tier of the system if you want to talk in tiers. I would think about it across the entire continuum of supports, looking at all materials, all aspects of our thought toward engagement for folks to make sure to tap into personal interest, think about sustained motivation. I'm going to design my best from the get-go, applying principles for universal design for learning. I'm also then going to acknowledge that with my best of designs, I'm still probably going to have to differentiate, either planned or on the spot as I'm learning about my local population. So acknowledging that there's a school-wide framework for UDL, there's a school-wide framework for differentiated instruction that's now in a context of a multi-tiered system of support. And we're differentiating across all of the tiers of support. And finally, the integrated here refers to two things. One that I've already stated is the content areas are now integrated. We're looking at the whole child to figure out what's going on and how best to prevent combined academic challenges and to problem solve when those challenges are coming together or remaining separate so that you're getting the best thing that you need within your particular profile, whether that be need of I'm struggling in these areas or need being I'm really advanced, I need greater challenge in these areas. So integrating content, also integrating systems to become a system. You'll see in our language we talk about a multi-tiered system of supports. So we move the S's. How many S's in supports? Integrated also in terms of roles and responsibilities. Right? So it's no longer separate silos of here's what the special educators do, here's what the Title I folks do, here's what the English language learner folks do, and then here's what these other general education folks are doing. We're thinking about a school-wide integrated system. So what's the best instruction in the areas of language, and then how are we applying that across all populations? Not you're now going to get the ELL curriculum. right? But let's be thinking about those best practices across everything that we're doing. And again, you're going to design based on your population. So in Dorchester, Massachusetts, at the Henderson School, they are now certifying all educators to be English learner teachers on top of their current certification, because that's what their population requires. There's a multitude of languages spoken at the Henderson School in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and they've got to be ready for the full diversity of those students. So they've just been systematically investing in making sure that all teachers are also EL certified. An integrated system. It's no longer, you're going to take these kids, you're going to take those kids, right? We're all hands on deck. So that comes together across the continuum of support. Within each kind of focused area of support, if you will, we're thinking, of course, about teams coming together to do the work. Those teams are going to reflect the work at hand and the students that are touched by that aspect of the system. So all students are touched by the universal system. We want to make sure that we've got representation of all key adults within the system and a voice within that decision making for continuous improvement purposes as well. We're looking at core sets of data in the universal arena. We're probably paying attention particularly to screening and historical data that we have on individual kiddos. We're paying attention to our culture climate data, which is going to direct us in certain ways. We're looking at universal screening on the behavioral side within that conversation. Multiple data sources that are going to inform our design and our differentiation in the core. And we're doing our best first instruction, looking at the higher effect practices that we can deliver that first teach with. Right? So what are the prioritized teaching approaches locally that are going to have the highest effect size? We've got agreement on that. We actually have a universal playbook of kind of 10 instructional approaches we want to make sure all teachers are really great at delivering. And those are lined up with our essential standards or prioritized standards. Right? I go into schools and if I hear teachers saying, I don't have time, I don't have time, I don't have time, my first question is always, do you have prioritized standards? Do you have essential standards that you teach to? Right? If I'm hearing from a teacher, I've got 35 different standards I'm teaching to in English language arts this year. Okay, we've got to have a conversation about prioritized standards because this is a strategy that could be really helpful in your setting. Right? So applying evidence-based practices with prioritized standards and a coherent curriculum aligned vertically and horizontally and fully integrated. Same thing going on in additional support. Maybe some shifting data sources are informing that. We're making sure that if you're leveraging grade level teams or PLCs, that those are integrated teams with extended team members participating as needed depending on the conversations you're having about particular groups of students who may be at risk or in need of some additional support. And now we're also bringing in that conversation of maybe targeted skill interventions as needed for the different groups within our school. And as we go up to intensified support, again, expanded grade level and teaching teams where we're bringing in some cases, family members, external agencies for wraparound services and support, mental health agencies within our conversations. In New Hampshire, and I think you're all getting hit here in Indiana with kind of secondary impact from the opioid epidemic. I just heard on the news yesterday from a middle school that I've done some work with for the last 5 years, Hudson Memorial School, where 6 different kids in that building have lost parents in the past year to opioid overdoses or to suicide as a secondary result to the opioid epidemic in New Hampshire. 6 kids in one building. We're having to organize in some different ways here, right? So we're going to start integrating that into the core design of what we're doing, and we're acknowledging we're going to be in conversations with external agencies as well as we go through this system of support for folks. It's a really quick synthesis of the shifts from PBIS to RTI to looking at an integrated team, an integrated system. The biggest shifts appear to be in this notion of an integrated collaborative team. right? Having those multiple stakeholders at the table for the conversations to lead the entire system, and then to be engaged in the problem solving at group and individual or intensified student levels. That seems to be the biggest new piece of this as we look at MTSS. Any questions about what I've said thus far? Who is in charge of this?
Is it an adjunct?
I vote Jan. So that's part of the beauty when we talk about integrated collaborative teams. We're also talking about distributed leadership, so it's not hanging on the hat of one individual in the system. So as we do our work with schools and with districts, our first step in the intervention process for us as technical assistance providers is to put together an integrated distributed leadership team who are the go-to folks for program level decisions for school-wide decision making. We would want administrative representation on that, as well as family representation. Teachers, general and specialized, represented within that decision-making body, with really clear input and feedback channels to and from that team, so that they can collect up student voice, family voice, community voice, teacher and staff voice into their decision-making. But you've got one unified distributed leadership structure that's leading and monitoring the implementation of multi-tiered system of support school-wide. Right? So that you don't have the SPED team, the RTI team, the PBIS Tier 1 team, Tier 2 team, Tier 3 team, right? All working separately. Great question. Give her extra food. You can go first. Any other questions about what I've covered thus far? When you return from lunch, we're going to play bingo as an entry point to taking a look at 14 specific components of MTSS, and then we're going to kind of check for understanding. I don't want to overteach to stuff that you may already understand. I'm seeing a lot of supportive nods as we're going. So when you come back, we're going to play bingo to kind of introduce the 14 concepts, and then we're actually going to give you a handout that has all 14 in them, and you're going to do a little bit of kind of read through to check your understanding, because if you can read it and you already know what that means, we don't need to teach that. So we're going to do a little check on that when you come back.